All right, so yesterday we talked about stereotypes, discrimination, and prejudice, and we had one more slide to look at on prejudices. We're going to talk about self-fulfilling prophecies. Prejudices, which are negative attitudes, which are often based in stereotypes, which we talked about yesterday, are overgeneralizations of people groups, can lead to what we call self-fulfilling prophecies. A self-fulfilling prophecy is a prediction that causes itself to be true. So if I have a prejudice, a preconceived negative idea rooted in a stereotype about a particular group, and that group starts to hear about that idea enough times, there's an idea out there that that group might start to act in a way that causes that idea to become true. So we might call that a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we can see that in a number of different ways in terms of a lot of different situations and contexts. One of the most classic examples of self-fulfilling prophecies was demonstrated by a teacher some years ago in a classroom setting. There's a documentary that came out a few years ago by the PBS show Frontline called A Class Divided. And in that particular setting, a teacher demonstrated that if she was to split up the class and have them act in different ways in terms of just their eye color, that students would actually start to behave in ways that illustrated what she was teaching students about blue-eyed versus brown-eyed children. The teacher actually did the lesson not too long after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and she wanted to do it as a way to teach children about discrimination, racial discrimination, and about prejudices and stereotypes and how powerful they were. And she took the class and divided them based on their eye color and started to tell the students that the brown-eyed students were were inferior to the blue-eyed students, and started to provide all kinds of specific examples and feed the children's minds with these ideas of this stereotype of the brown-eyed children being inferior to the blue-eyed. And within just a matter of a very short period of time, the children started to believe that and act in really some pretty vicious and incredibly cruel ways. And these were little kids that had just days before this experiment that the teacher did, been perfect little children who were just like other children, had times where they didn't do things maybe that were completely moral or right, but that had been friends with children who had different eye color and had never really acted in a way that something so small as eye color would make you mistreat your fellow classmate. And another experiment that was done, that first one, this one that was done by the school teacher, really isn't considered a scientific experiment. It was just something, a very powerful example of the power of self-fulfilling prophecies. This one, though, by two guys named Rosenthal and Jacobson, often referred to as the Pygmalion effect experiment, was an experiment also done in a school setting where Rosenthal and Jacobson convinced a school system to allow them in that school system to basically lie to the teachers and the students about who the gifted or the Horizons type students were in that school setting. And they told certain teachers that their students were the gifted students and that's the kind of student they had. And then others, they just told they had average level students. And what they had really done was given everybody a random assortment of students. And so there were no gifted students in certain classes and no classes that didn't have the gifted students. But what they found was that just within 1 year, that students that were in the classes in which they had lied to the teachers about having the gifted students, those students actually either caught up with the actual gifted students, or in some cases even surpassed the academic performance of the gifted students on standardized tests. And so their point was that they were able to lie to the teachers and the students. By way of lying to the teachers thought they had the gifted students, and because the teachers thought they had the gifted students, they told and treated their students like they were the gifted students, even though they didn't have gifted students. And in the process, the teachers and the students started to act in ways that they believed teachers acted of gifted students, and that students who were gifted acted, and it started to affect the way that teachers taught, students learned, and it also could serve as an illustration of the self-fulfilling prophecy in that those students in the supposed gifted classes caught up with or even outperformed the actual gifted students. And so that also would serve as an example of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the idea is, all right, prejudices are not just these ideas in the minds of people that have them, but if we have these prejudices, these negative attitudes rooted in stereotypes against certain peoples, that if they are particularly powerful prejudices or particularly heinous prejudices, that if we share them with and treat people based on those prejudices enough times, then they may start to believe some of those things about those prejudices and act in ways to reinforce those prejudices as well. The next topic we'll look at is aggression. And aggression can really be defined and explained in terms of both biology and psychology, the body as well as the mind. When we look at biology, what we do see is that when we look at twin studies, we do see that higher levels of aggression found in identical twins. There's a high correlation with those sets of identical twins. That is, you have more similarities in the aggression of identical twins than you have in the similarity of fraternal twins. The other thing that we see in terms of biology is that the Y chromosome, males are XY chromosome, female XX chromosome, that the Y chromosome does seem to matter. And so you have this higher rates of aggressive behavior in males than you do with females. With neural components, parts of the nervous system, we know that play a role in aggression. The amygdala plays a role in that it is the part of the limbic system that often lights up when someone is engaging in aggressive behavior. We learned earlier this year the amygdala is the part of the brain that plays a significant role in fear and aggression. The frontal lobe plays a role in that it is the decision-making center of the brain. So in terms of someone determining whether they're going to act aggressively, it's the frontal lobe that's kind of enhancing or enabling them to make that decision about whether they're going to be aggressive or not. And what's interesting is that there's a significant correlation between people who we consider aggressive, such as people who are in prison for crimes that we consider violent and aggressive, and some sort of reduced capacity in their frontal lobe. There's been studies that show that frontal lobes of those in prison are in some way different than those of those who are not in prison. Other biological factors include what we call biochemical factors, that is, hormones. Higher levels of testosterone, for example, correlate with aggression, and so that is a biochemical factor. And alcohol and the interaction with the brain and how it, because we know that it is a drug that we classify as a suppressant, that it is, or a depressant rather, because it's a depressant, it can impact the brain and cause is a tricky word, but can impact the kinds of decisions that someone might make about aggressive behavior. So that's the biology of aggression. The psychology of aggression, we're going to deal with the thought processes and things like that, whereas biology, we deal with the physical contributors to aggression. So with psychology of aggression, we look at all the different thought factors and theories about the mind and behavior and things that impact aggression. We learned earlier this year about Bandura and his Bobo doll experiment and modeling, and his social learning theory that basically just says that people learn aggression by watching or having models of aggression, and that we do learn behavior by seeing people who engage in it. And that's one of the reasons why we're not surprised then to know that people who act violently and aggressively often have had models of that violent aggressive behavior in their homes. When we look at, for example, domestic violence, people who engage in domestic violence often come from backgrounds where they observed domestic violence when they were a child in their home. One really important principle dealing with the psychology of aggression is this frustration aggression principle. It basically makes the argument, this principle, that when we become frustrated, we need kind of an outlet, and so we act in an aggressive way. You could say it's kind of related to catharsis hypothesis, this idea that we need something to take out and have an emotional release, and it deals specifically with emotional release in the context of aggression, that we become frustrated and we become aggressive because of that frustration, and so we act violent and aggressive because of things that bother us and that frustrate us to a certain level. Then we do know, too, that studies have shown significant correlation between things that are aversive, that is, things that we don't find pleasant, or things that are annoying, things that we'd rather avoid, and our levels of violence or aggression. For example, significant correlation between the temperatures in the air and violent crime. Even there have been some studies that have noted that people will act more violently when exposed to unpleasant smells, foul odors, or higher levels of pollutants in the air. And so there have been correlative studies that show things like that can relate to and have a relationship with aggression. Here's a graph that just shows hot weather and aggression. Now, keep in mind, we talked earlier this year that about correlation is not causation. This does not mean that temperature causes violent behavior. But you can see that as temperature soars, so does aggressive behavior. Now, this graph is also a great example of how, in some ways, you can construct a graph that might make a correlation seem more dramatic than it actually is. Note that the way that the graph is constructed, there's only a half of a violent crime, murder, rape, etc. over here, and that because of the way that's constructed, we're talking about a difference between 6.5 and 7 3/4 of a crime here between these two temperature changes. So I don't know, I think the graph itself makes it seem like there's much more of a violent change in the aggressive behavior between the temperatures than there really is. But again, still there's been studies that show that there is a correlation between the two. What about aggression and violent programming, television? Is there any connection between playing violent video games or watching violent television and engaging in violent behavior? That's basically what Bandura said in his Bobo doll experiment, was that if a child sees behavior, then they are more likely to engage in that behavior, right? So is that something for us to be concerned about? Well, here's some things, here are some facts. By the time a child is 18, they will have spent more time typically in front of a television screen than in school. And considering that from the time they're a kindergartner until they're 18 years of age, we're often talking about around 8 hours a day. That's a significant thing to think about. How does that happen? Well, you have to remember summer months where the child is not in school, the vacation periods, and the number of years before they actually start school. And if you consider those, it's not hard to imagine how that happens. These statistics, by the way, are a little outdated, a few years old. So, with increasing number of amount of video programming being watched on personal electronic devices like your iPhones and such, I wonder if the amount of video content that children watch these days is even more. 2/3 of all homes have 3 or more television sets. And again, when you now look at things like iPhones, that's practically in some ways like having your own personal television, right? By the time a child has finished elementary school, one study estimated that they will have witnessed 8,000 murders and 100,000 other acts of violence on television. The other thing to consider that kind of pairs with that is that a lot of times these violent acts that are portrayed on television don't show the victim's pain, don't show things like the person actually dying, or they don't show blood. They don't show the things that the television channel or television production company can't show because they don't want to get a certain rating and be regulated by the FCC in a certain way. But you can make the argument that what that does is maybe sort of desensitize children to violent behavior if they've seen 8,000 murders and 100,000 other acts of violence, and many times there's no victim who's in extreme excruciating pain because of that. And the other thing is there's a strong positive correlation. If you kind of trace an average number of hours of television watching over the last 50 years or so, and then look at violent behavior, there's a strong positive correlation with that aggression. Whether or not that means watching violent television causes violent behavior, again, correlation is not causation. But I think all of these things together, you can make a pretty significant argument that it's at least something for us to be concerned about, even if we can't scientifically prove that it's something that violent television programming or violent video games causes violent behavior. Next, we're going to look at conflict and how conflict is a significant thing to think about in terms of social psychology. Conflict we might define as a perceived incompatibility of actions, goals, or ideas. Again, in sociology, sometimes we define conflict as when there's two opposing groups who are trying to get the same thing, and only one of those two groups or one of those two people can end up with that thing. The interesting thing, though, is that sometimes we perceive things as a conflict, perceive things as what we might call a zero-sum game, where only one party can win, so to speak, when in reality, that's not the way things are in reality. In the context of talking about conflict, one specific term you want to be familiar with is that of a social trap. A social trap is a situation in which the people involved or the groups involved, if they both go for their own self-interest, they become caught up in mutually destructive behavior. Or in other words, if both people look out for themselves or both groups go for what they perceive to be the best for themselves, they both end up in behavior that's harmful for them, when if they had kind of realized that there might be a better way, that if both of them had kind of not gone for what they perceived as what was best for them, they could have both ended up with a better end result than if they had both gone for their own best interest. Let's, for example, look at this situation. This example is called a non-zero-sum game, and it really powerfully illustrates what happens in a social trap. Now, let's say that this student here, person one, we'll call person one Sarah, that Sarah is presented with a scenario here. Sarah Each of the stars here represents something that you can have. Do you want $8, $20, or $0? All right, well, Sarah, well, of course, she wants $20, the highest amount possible, right? All right, now person 2, we'll call person 2 Joe. Joe, each of these little red plus marks illustrates the amount of money you could have. What would you like? Well, Joe, again, sees the same choices, $8, $20, $0, 0. I want $20. All right, well, if you look at the intersection of the two choices, where here is the column that Sarah chose, okay? Here is the column that Joe chose. The intersection of their choices, because Sarah chose $20 and Joe chose $20, is they both get nothing. All right, so again, here are Joe's choices, okay? Would you like the possibility of getting $8 or $20 or $8 or $0, Joe, or the possibility of getting $20 or $0? Well, of course, Joe's going to pick $20 or $0. All right, Sarah, how about you? Would you like the possibility of getting $8 or $0, or the possibility of getting $20 or $0? Oh, well, I take the possibility of $20 or $0, not $8 or $0. Well, the problem is if they both pick that choice, they both end up with nothing, $0 and $0. What we need for them to both see is if they both had selected $8 or $0, they both would have ended up with $8. All right. But the problem is that if they both perceive their best interest, they both get nothing. If one of them selects the 8 and 0 and one selects the 20 or 0, then one gets 20 and one gets nothing. If both pick 20 or 0, they both get nothing. It's only if they both select the 8 or 0 option that they end up with both getting $8. And so this, because we often see conflicts in life as what we call a zero-sum game. Somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. We can get caught in this social trap situation where we, pursuing our self-interest and then being opposite of somebody else who's pursuing their self-interest, both lose. It's a lose-lose situation. That is a social trap. All right, we're also going to look today at attraction. And when we say attraction, we're not just talking about romantic, physical, sexual arousal attraction. We're just talking about liking a person, you might have a good friend. Why are you attracted to that person? In the sense that you prefer their company and you like them and you like to be around them more than you do other people. But all of these principles can apply both in a romantic setting as well as in a non-romantic setting in terms of preference of one type of person or a thing over another. And so we're going to talk about 5 specific factors of attraction. The first is proximity. You might be familiar with the fact that proximity just means how close you are to something. And so physical nearness might be another way to describe that. We already talked about a little bit this unit about the mere exposure effect. The idea that the more exposure someone has to someone or something, the more likely they are to prefer it. A way to express the mere exposure effect is that familiarity breeds fondness. Or to say it another way, we could talk about an example of a lady from Taiwan who received letters from a man years and years and years. For years she received these letters. I can't remember the context of why he was away, but there was a reason that he couldn't be there with her, and he wrote these letters to her years after year after year. And so she was receiving these letters. They were being delivered to her. I think it was a weekly basis or something like that. And at the end of the story, what happens? Does she fall in love with the man who wrote the letters? No, she falls in love with the man who delivers the letters, the postman. And so again, because he was in her close proximity, delivering the letters to her on a frequent basis, he falls in love, or she falls in love with him, and he with her. Sounds like a made-for-TV movie, doesn't it? What about classmates? Sometimes you might come to like someone simply because you see them and sit next to them every day. Whether it's in this class or another class, just being around them may be a contributing factor. Again, close proximity feeds attraction or likeness, it seems. All right, then we have reciprocal liking. Okay, to reciprocate means to give back. We talked about norms of reciprocity as one of the compliance strategies. You do something for me, I do something for you. When we talk about reciprocal liking, we basically just say it's more likely that you like someone who likes you back. All right, they make you feel good about yourself by liking you, and you like them back. All right, similar to the feel-good, do-good phenomenon we talked about earlier this year, where we said when we feel good about ourselves, when we feel good in general, we're more likely to do good for other people. Well, if someone likes you, you're very likely to like them back, and that makes a lot of sense. All right. Similarity. We are more likely to like things that are like ourselves, including people. There was a song back in the 80s or 90s, late 80s, early 90s, by Paula Abdul called Opposites Attract. And the whole basis of the song was how people who are opposites are more likely to be attracted to each other. And there's this weird music video where there's this like bad boy cat person in the video who is also a cartoon opposite of Paula Abdul. And the whole song is, again, about opposites of being attracted to each other. The reality is that's not really all that accurate. Psychological science tells us that rather than saying opposites attract, we should say opposites do not attract, or that birds of the same feather do flock together, one of the expressions says. And so another way to say that is similarity breeds content. We like things that are similar to ourselves. Another factor in liking or attraction is liking through association. That we are maybe sometimes conditioned to like things because we associate one stimuli with another stimuli that we like. Let's say, for example, that if I were incredibly fond of a certain restaurant, they had great food, I loved the environment, I just got a really great feel-good feeling every time I went into that restaurant, and every time I went there, I see the same waitress and interact with her. This liking through association principle says that I might come to like the waitress because I associate her with the good feelings I get by going to the restaurant. It's similar to the principle of transference in psychoanalytic therapy. That is that like in transference, where I come to have the same feelings from my therapist that I have for the things that we talk about. With this principle of liking through association, I really enjoy or like a certain place or a person or a thing, and then because there's another thing or person associated with that thing that I already like, I come to like and prefer it as well. And then physical attractiveness is also a factor. What does that look like? Here are some people, some famous, maybe some not so famous, or some that you've never heard of before or never seen before, who are considered attractive. Well, what is it about them that makes them attractive? Well, one of the things before we talk about that is that let's talk about what does science tell us about those who are considered attractive? Well, I hate to break it to you, but it does actually predict dating frequency. That is, people who are considered physically attractive do date more than those who are not. The other thing is that's really interesting, fair or unfair, is that people who look at those who are considered attractive consider those people healthier, happier, even more honest. That's probably, to me, the most disturbing one, that we consider people who are more attractive to be more honest just by what they look like, and even more successful than people who are less attractive. How do you do that? How do you measure that in a study? Well, you present people with pictures of those individuals who they've never seen before, never met before, and you ask them first to rate their attractiveness, and then you ask them to predict success. Who do you think is the more successful person? And if you make people do that in a study, you have people rating those who are more attractive as being more successful, and more healthy, more happy, more honest, etc. All right. So what is beauty? Well, there's a lot of culturally relative factors, a lot of things that people see as being attractive in one culture that's not considered attractive in another. But two things that do seem to be culturally universal, that is, you'll see them in almost every specific culture in humanity, is youth. Young is attractive over old, okay, and symmetry, that there's balance in a face, that instead of having one ear higher than the other, or one nostril slightly larger than the other, or one eye that's a little bit jacked up and a little bit higher than the other, or an eyebrow that's higher than the other, there's symmetry, that the left side reflects the right side. And so those two things seem to be two things that are culturally universal in terms of beauty, what societies, what cultures consider beautiful. Other than that, there's a lot of variation, even things that in our Western culture we might consider beautiful. You look at things like body size and body type. You can see differences in our own Western society in body types and what's beautiful, changing in history, but even in modern times you can compare cultures and see that this picture that reflects the more Arab population in the country of Mauritania of Africa, it is such a part of their culture that large is in, or we might say fat is where it's at, that in that culture they have force-fed young girls so much that the government has stepped in there and kind of had to intervene to prevent the unhealthy behavior of force-feeding the women. And you contrast that with Western society where not fat is where it's at, but thin is in, or whatever. And you can see that even that is not a cultural universal. There's also some Pacific Islander nations where large is kind of considered a sign of wealth and health, even though we know that science tells us it's not necessarily anything remotely close to a sign of health. And so, you can look at all kinds of historical examples, foot binding in Asian cultures, and tiny feet being beautiful, body modification of different sorts that some people past and present consider beautiful, gauges in the ears, large mouthpieces in some tribal groups, and I don't even know what this is, but the point is, beauty is, as the expression says, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, except for, it seems, psychological science tells us, youth and symmetry. The last topic we'll look at is prosocial behavior. Okay, we talked about violence and aggression, things that are negative in terms of behavior. Prosocial behavior is pro-social, so positively social behavior. There's a really vivid case with a young lady in New York. I think it was in the 1950s or 60s. Her name was Kitty Genovese. And Kitty Genovese was a victim of a brutal crime involving sexual assault and eventually her murder. But the reason the case stands out as an example of what we call the bystander effect is that at night, Kitty Genovese was assaulted, and there was a lot of noise, and there were a lot of people who heard what was going on. It came out in the investigation afterwards that many of her neighbors had heard what was going on, and again, because of the nature of the crime, it was very loud. There were lots of screams and other sounds from doors slamming and other things like that. And nobody did anything. No neighbors even called the police. in the early part of the crime, no one intervened. I mean, we can certainly understand people not feeling like they want to, put themselves in harm's way if someone's being attacked. But why don't you call the police? Why don't you call someone who should be doing something about it? And it powerfully illustrated the bystander effect. And it was a particularly graphic, gruesome, heinous crime where Kitty Genovese was raped multiple times, and then her assailant, the guy who committed the crime, left her alive, but then decided, I want to come back and finish the job, and murdered her. And there was this extended period of time where someone could have done something, could have called the police, maybe could have saved her life, but nobody did. Why didn't they? Why were they all bystanders? Why were all of Kitty Genovese's neighbors bystanders? And her case serves as a pretty powerful example of this bystander effect, that generally, that the more the people are around, the more people there are around in the situation, the less chance there is that someone will intervene and offer assistance. That's the bystander effect, that people will be bystanders when there are other people around. Why is that? Well, the concept that's at play there is what's called diffusion of responsibility. This idea that the more people there are around, the less people feel personally responsible. Let's say that in this class today, someone were to stand up and just start really giving crap to somebody else in the class, and just being a jerk to somebody, and calling them horrible things, and the person starts to cry, and really, really, there's emotional trauma that's clearly being experienced. Well, the bystander effect says that because of the size of the class, there's a greater chance that people will not intervene. People will not say anything to the person who's being a jerk, as compared to a setting where there's three people. There's the person that's being incredibly mean, the person that they're being mean to, and one person. Why is that? Well, when there's lots of other people around, no one feels as responsible as if there were fewer people around. You can kind of put yourself in the position of being that third person. If you're the only person there that can offer help to the person who's being mistreated in a setting, it's almost like you might believe you're the only person that can do anything about it. Whereas if there are lots of people, because there are lots of people who could do something about it, it's easy to go, one of the other 28 people will do something about it. So we call it diffusion of responsibility. Now, that's the kind of the negative aspect of human behavior, this bystander effect. But we do see that in humans, we sometimes engage in altruistic behavior, or engage in altruism. Altruism is unselfish regard for the welfare of others. So altruistic behavior, or prosocial behavior, is behavior that people engage in, feeding the homeless, doing something nice for somebody where they don't expect anything in return. They act in an unselfish way, looking out for the welfare of other people. So what is it that is going to make people be altruistic and counteract the bystander effect? Some things that contribute towards that. One is presence of examples. Having seen someone in the past that acts in the same way, that acts altruistically, increases the likelihood. All right, and that's kind of Bandura's modeling, right? Monkey see, monkey do. If someone's not in a hurry, sad but true. If someone feels like they're in a hurry, then they're not as likely to act altruistically as if they were not in a hurry. Then if the victim really appears to need or deserve help, and that's kind of tricky, who's to say who needs and who deserves help, all right? But if we see a situation where we kind of feel like, that person deserves it, let's say you go back to the situation again where somebody's picking on someone in the class today. If you kind of feel like that person who's being picked on had it coming to them for one reason or another, you can easily see why you wouldn't act altruistically and intervene. Here's one thing that's kind of concerning. We're more likely to act if the victim is similar to ourselves. And that kind of maybe goes back to the liking by similarity, liking things that are similar to ourselves. We're more likely to intervene if we share some common traits with the victim. If the crime is taking place in a small town or a rural area, that seems to correlate with higher levels of altruism. If there's feelings of guilt that are conjured up in the person who's watching the crime or watching a situation where they feel like they will intervene, that's going to increase the likelihood of someone intervening and counteracting the bystander effect. And then two other things. This one kind of seems related to not in a hurry. If I'm focused on other people and not preoccupied with myself and my kind of life, then I'm more likely to intervene and act altruistically. And if I'm in a good mood, and again, that relates to the concept we talked about earlier this year, the feel good, do good phenomenon. So all of those are things that contribute to altruistic behavior.